On this episode of the show, I have with me John Fiedler. He is SVP of Engineering and CISO at Ironclad, and we're going to be talking about a day in the life of a technology leader. I actually haven't covered this before, and I thought it'd be really interesting to bring that to you guys. And we're going to talk about some of where John's time goes as an executive and an engineering leader. I mean, it's not easy to be an engineering manager at times. And how does he optimize his day? What slows him down? And if you're actually moving from an IC role or thinking about moving from an IC role to a leadership position, how do you grapple with that? It's a whole different, it's really a career switch, and you got to develop all new natural patterns. And John's going to walk us through a bunch here. So, John, I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Amir. Happy to be on. It's going to be exciting, and love this topic and very passionate around it.
Absolutely. Before we dive in, if you could you give us all just an overview of what Ironclad does?
Yeah, Ironclad is the leader in contract lifecycle management. There's an acronym that we go by, like CLM. If you're working in the legal space, if you're working with any contract, you're going to know Ironclad. We're essentially the enterprise leader in all contract management now. It's been a lot of fun, play a lot of roles and hats, and it's been just a really enjoyable company to work for. So if you need a contracting solution, look up Ironclad.
Absolutely. All right. So this topic's, I think it's fantastic, because I think a lot of times, if you're not in a leadership position, and this is actually very applicable to any discipline, right? I will talk about it in terms of technology. So, that's just what we're talking about, but I don't think it's, this conversation will transcend, because we are talking about leadership. And actually, before we dive into how to do a better job of transitioning to leadership roles, let's actually get a little bit of insight into what your day looks like, right? So I'm sure a lot of the leaders will probably be nodding their heads once they hear your day, but I am curious, what does a typical day, where do you spend your time if you're going to just break out just where time is spent during a day or during a week?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of it's I always love this answer from leaders, but they'll say it depends. It depends on where you're at in the year. It depends on kind of your role. But there's, I would say, a lot of commonality that I've seen across every role I've had or other executives that I've worked with. And it's a bit chaotic. You have an insane amount of context switching that you will do from one day to the next, or 1 week to the next, or even one quarter to the next. And depending, on, let's say, what size, I'm at a startup right now, so you're probably wearing a lot more hats than maybe at a giant enterprise. And, you're meeting with customers, you're meeting with executives trying to understand where the businesses go, or trying to shape that vision. If you're into technology leadership, you're responsible for part of that technology strategy as well. If you're in a certain domain, the hottest thing right now is AI, you better have great, AI strategy. A lot of that too revolves around, well, if you have a strategy, that also means you're responsible for the execution. So not just the roadmap execution, all the different project statuses and the communication up to your management and then down from the team as well, if you think in that way. And then you're also responsible for measuring everything that's going on, right, at any time. So either it's your team, your company, your organization plan, and then, there's a lot of side quests that you'll end up doing. Like, we might be doing a big marketing push, and you're the technology leader, and you're going to have to, say something inspirational and or keep with the messaging pattern of the company that you might be involved with. And then a lot of that too is in your day-to-day is you're managing your domain. Maybe you're the AI leader, data, infrastructure, whatever it may be. You're meeting with those teams. You're having a lot of one-on-ones. In the space here in technology, there's a lot of people involved. You could be doing upwards from 1 to maybe 5 to 6 one-on-ones in a day. And then you're responsible for the communication. I love this. One of my favorite mentors and bosses that I had, he coined this term. You're also the communication architect for your entire organization. And then, there's a lot of people involved, but you're recruiting. You're trying to maybe motivate, your team. There's many different, I would say, situations that you have to deal with in a day-to-day. A lot of it is people related. And then, to kind of top it off, you create the environment for success and most likely the environment that you're in for your technology team or teams. And you establish that culture as well, right? So all of this stuff, I was looking back a couple of months ago, like what I was doing. So it's just all of this I would do maybe in like a week. And the sheer amount of context switching can be a little bit overwhelming at times. You kind of get used to it over a little bit, but it's a little bit chaotic. Some technology leaders, they love that. They love the chaoticness in the day to day. But yeah, you wear a lot of hats, and no one really tells you what you're up for. You just kind of have to go with it. You go with the flow, depending on how your organization operates. So.
Let me ask you this question. I hadn't thought about it, but as you were going through your day, it did make me think that when we are in individual contributor roles, it's fairly easy to look and go, I feel like I know what I accomplished, right? I feel like there's a easier dotted line. When you're technology executive, and I guess the higher up you go, it gets a little bit muddier because, as you just spoke about, you're responsible in touching so many different facets of the engineering team in this case. When you look at yourself, and I'm not talking about your managers, you yourself, when you look back and you look at a quarter or however way you review your own self, how do you look back and help yourself identify the value add that you brought to the team? Because it might not be the tangible X shipped. Like, it's a little bit harder to tell. What do you do?
That is a great question. I think a lot of first-time managers kind of struggle with this, and I think over time you get better. I would say though, if you go back to your roots, and most technology leaders start from being an IC, there's a lot of execution that happens. I just call it execution, but a lot of projects that need to be delivered. You can start there. It was like, oh yeah, we delivered X thing, right? We hit this roadmap. We have, a lot of technology companies have, I would say in Q3, they're marching towards a conference that they might have. Let's say it's Dreamforce. There's a big launch. If you've launched that and you've hit all the dates and your team's been successful and you have happy customers, in the end of the day, if your customers are loving that and you've shipped it on time, that is a fantastic, I would say, outcome. Now, the journey to get there is always interesting. Some things go off track. Some things, if you have a really, really good team, this kind of fits in place. But it also depends on kind of what you've been doing. I worked in my career too. There's a lot of teams that are involved in making this successful. I think I found the best engineering managers are very data driven. They're not really looking at the sentiment from other individuals. Oh yeah, this is really going really, really good. It's like, well, can I see the data, right? I manage a lot of infrastructure teams. Infrastructure teams don't get any glory. They're managing hundreds, thousands of containers probably these days, and no one really knows. But the site's always up. Probably sites these days have been the most stable I've ever seen in my career. It's just absolutely, truly amazing how technology is really advanced. And, a lot of those are your cloud costs, your COGS, cost from a financial, bottom line. So you can look at that aspect. A lot of teams too is just the people that you manage. Are they happy? Are you hitting your recruiting goals? Are you, is your team from when you have a pulse just really having a great time? Are you guys fitting in a culture? So I think you kind of look at these patterns that you can see. Are you executing? Are your people happy? Is the business getting the needs from its really in the end? Are your customers happy? And I think you can look across these different pillars and kind of measure your success. There's really no playbook. I think it's funny. I had a chat with a people manager, in HR, or formerly HR, and people teams are like, hey, what's the rubric, for a VP plus person? It really isn't one. I like at any company I've been in technology these days, there isn't one. It's kind of very subjective, which I don't really think is great in some aspects, but it's also like the environment changes so much. The business has changed so much. Every year there's a brand new technology you have to go and deliver. I think it's a little bit hard to kind of define those roles sometimes, which I also think is kind of why, some engineering managers can struggle with that ambiguity of like, how are you measured? And so sometimes it's just sit down with your boss and like, let's go through it. That's
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is really great insight. And I guess, as you're looking at, you mentioned context switching is something that is a challenge. Obviously, the sheer amount of meetings clearly will slow you down. Is there anything else out there that you might not be as obvious that does end up, slowing you down, taking up some time and keeping you from what you need to do?
Yes, I would say so. And things that slow you down, this is kind of funny. It depends, it depends on the size of the organization you have. So let's say you work for the really, really large company, and I work for a company that had 80,000 people. They're kind of stuck in their ways. And what slows you down sometimes is actually just the organizational debt or organizational processes that you kind of have to, adhere to. So one of the things I think is really interesting from a startup is they push code, let's say every single day, every single week, every single month. It's very rapid paced. You're constant delivery. When I was working for a giant enterprise, we had 3 releases a year. And that mental shift and that just the ability to, get features and value out to customers was a very big change. I think because I've gone through small companies to large companies and back to small and large. And this is the biggest thing that you always see is, almost at larger organizations, you're kind of handcuffed on how fast you can move because there's so many processes that you have to adhere to. Let's say, a giant enterprise, you have a lot of security, availability. You have so many different customers. If you push, let's say a brand new feature and it doesn't go well, and it takes down, 100 companies, those 100 companies could be running 25% of the world's infrastructure. Let's say, your customers like Microsoft or Amazon or, Shopify or something like that. You really have huge impact the global organization that's running. I think look at last year's CrowdStrike bug, right? Just the world kind of slowed down. It's like, wow, technology has a huge pace. At a smaller company, you probably don't have as many. You still have probably very, very important customers, but you need to keep stable, and they have to have a great time in your platform. But it's not as nearly as I would say global impact. And over time that obviously grows. So there's reasons for that. I would say too, the amount of if you're managing a large organization, people. Sometimes this is if you have a great org and a great culture, it makes your life so much easier. And that's normally set by the top and the CEO and the founders, I would say, depending on how that company operates. And that can make your world so much easier. But if you're doing a massive reorg or there's a shakeup in technology and you're managing 150 people, and let's say you might have a VP or a director that leaves, and now you have to run those teams as well. You're just inundated by people questions, communication. I would say just keeping everyone happy. You're almost like a psychologist in some ways. You have to wear that hat. And the other thing I think sometimes what I find is interesting around what can slow you down, yourself. A lot of times leaders actually set the pace. And I think you have somewhat control, I would say, over your domain, what it might be. And now if you're a CTO, you're obviously responsible for the entire technology strategy, but you are setting that pace, right? And a lot of large organizations are kind of set in their ways. Hey, Q3 is going to be our launch. We're gonna have our big conference, and we're gonna launch all these things. So you're kind of like set. We have to hit these dates for our conference. If you don't have that, you can set that pace. You could ship. I think it's a New Relic ships almost monthly when they're trying to catch up to like Datadog, which is a fascinating story. And they really set a high pace. They had a high competitive environment over the last, I would say, decade. And so really, you have to set out where your customer is, where your market is, where you're at in relation to your market as well. And a lot of times you can actually be responsible for that pace, which is good and bad. Obviously, in the end of the day, you're going to have to balance that too. You have to make your team happy. You can't, obviously crush their lives. But it's also, in the end, you have a business that you're responsible for it as well, and trying to keep that in balance. That complexity is just, I'd say a lot for some individuals. So that context switching, that complexity, those really do slow you down quite a bit.
I guess for an engineering leader, where do you find time on your calendar to catch up, right? If you're obviously context switching is expensive and then you are jammed with other activities, do you proactively ensure yourself with time during your, looking at your calendar? Is it something that you just fit in where you can? How do you try to give yourself the opportunity to actually, or is that for the weekends and nights?
Yeah, that's a great question. Depending on the executive and how much responsibility you have, some execs just never sleep. And I've worked with them. They're up all day, every day, working on the weekends. I try to have a great, they kind of coined the term work-life balance, and I kind of respect after, 5, 6 p.m. and then even on the weekends if I can. But it really depends on where you're at. But if you're kind of as a leader, your calendar sets your day. And if you don't have control over your calendar calendar will control you. For the last several years, I was working like 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And that can get very, very tiring if you don't have good energy and you don't have good breaks kind of built in. So I've learned these like tricks over time where it's like, I saw this really great post. I think it was Jack Dorsey, who was running Twitter and I think Square at the time. He was running 2 different companies, and I was an engineering manager, and I was trying to optimize my day. And I read this post that he had where he'd go in on Monday and he would run one company, and then he'd for 8 hours, and then he'd go to the next company and run it for 8 hours as well. So he was managing 2 companies at the same time. And one thing I think was really fascinating is he would just focus on one domain and less context switching for that day. So he would go in, let's say Mondays, and he'd work on marketing for, let's say, Twitter, and then he'd go to Square, and then he'd also just focus on marketing. So that whole day, the context, he can kind of keep in his lane, in his brain to, I think, operate much better. And then he'd switch in the next day. I took this into engineering management, and I tried to do the same. I do a lot of one-on-ones, so I'm very people-oriented in my day-to-day. And so Tuesdays and Thursdays are like my people days normally. Mondays are company kind of kickoffs. A lot of startups will start, the week with the company kickoff, or a week that Monday. And then it's a lot of strategy and planning on I would say Mondays. And then for me, Wednesdays kind of catch up any projects that I might have. A lot of companies in tech these days have no meeting Wednesdays. And so you're trying to respect that. But it's a lot of like meeting strategy wise. Are we on track? And then Fridays, it's just culture day. You always have demos and or projects, kind of seeing how it is. And just, you always have to keep, a fun environment in mind and culture. And so I've tried to match that. Now, obviously, depending on, you don't have total control sometimes over your calendar. But if you work with your EAs, most of the technology leaders will have one. You kind of set these guidelines. I like to be a little bit hands-on too and do projects. I don't delegate 100%. And I find these work blocks or focus times in your calendar is insanely critical. So I'll sprinkle like 1 hour of just free time. And that 1 hour goes by very quick. It's either catching up with people who ping me on Slack, might be writing up a proposal or a strategy, or maybe you're, jumping on a webinar for the company the next day and you need to prep. These things are critical to manage on your calendar. And if you don't allow, those blocks in the day, you're doing that at night. You're doing that 7 to 12 p.m. and you're getting up at maybe 5 the next day. And so you're not getting a lot of sleep. Managing you and your calendar is insanely important, I would think. And that's one of the things I think engineering managers can struggle with, is that you actually have to manage yourself in the end of the day, not just your team, your organization. And that's a lot of fun, but it takes a lot of time to realize that.
When it comes to managing yourself, I think the one skill we don't really talk about as often is the ability to say no, to push back. obviously in the right way. It's easy to say no, but you have repercussions for the way you say no in this world. But when it comes to pushing back and defending your calendar, you can't be everywhere once. You described, the need to carve out some time if you can, context switching. Where do you, or how do you, when it comes to deciding meetings, saying no, being protective of your calendar, what are some of do you use any general guidelines? Is it per meeting? How do you approach this?
Yeah, I've seen I've in my career, I've actually kind of gone, I like to actually say yes, and I like to make other people happy. But if you do that too much, you'll just get overrun, and you'll have too many promises that you'll have to keep over time. I think the biggest thing I liked when I worked at Salesforce for a long time, they had this concept. They use their OKR systems called a V2 MOM. If it's not on your V2 MOM, I'm not doing it. And what was fantastic about that, I have some gripes about the V2 MOM and how it's kind of set up, but what I did love is like, hey, if it's not part of our priorities, why are we talking about it? And they were insanely focused all the way from the top CEO throughout the entire organization. And everyone would say this. And I think what I realized is that even at a very, very large company, they were able to gain focus very, very quickly by using that kind of term. And it's kind of ingrained in their culture. And I think, I've worked with some other companies. They don't really have, an OKR system or a V2 MOM or something like that. And I realized it's actually a big struggle because whatever the biggest fire is that you have right now, you have to go and tackle. And it's really, really hard to say no without that framework or structure that is like, hey, a lot happens during the year and there's a lot of demands on you and there's a lot of context switching where you kind of have to stay focused. And I would say having the ability to say no, it's easy to say no, I would think over time, but when the business has priorities, it's like, oh, this is our number one priority. No, I have to say yes to this. Let's go figure that out. But however, if I go down the list and there's the 8th priority, I can definitely say no to that because let's say, priority number 1 is failing, everyone on that. This is our number one priority. So I would say as a technology leader, having set priorities that you can actually look at on paper and communicate with other individuals is insanely important just for that one reason, to say no. I've had some people, I also work a lot in security, and it's hard to say no all the time. You're kind of like, no, you shouldn't do that. No, you shouldn't do that. I like to say yes, but, like, hey, yes, let's do that. Let's figure out like the right way. Either it's the right way, the right timing. Can we come back to this maybe in a quarter? Those are always good things. I think in the end, we work with a lot of people. And you really want to make them successful. Ironclad actually has this fantastic culture where we actually help everybody out. So a lot of people do say yes more, I would say, than most companies I've actually worked for. And it's a very pleasurable environment to work in. Versus others I've had, it's like no right away. And it's like, oh, you have to fight and beg and collaborate and try and negotiate, hey, can you get this on your roadmap? And it's like much, much harder to actually get things done in the end of the day. So I do think that as a good technology leader, you have to balance, when you say yes and no. So yeah,
I like it. And I guess when you're thinking about, maybe this is a question to wrap things up. When you are moving from an IC role into manager, we just outlined a lot of stuff that I'm sure you've accumulated knowledge over the years of being in a leadership role. And you said something really important. I think it's not actually discussed enough in the fact that when you are switching from being hands-on to leadership, it is a completely different job. It's no longer relying on the skills that got you there. It's developing skills that you may never really relied on previously or not as much to carry you through. When you think about everything you mentioned about that day-to-day, obviously a lot of this is learned patterns, learned optimizations as a leader. But when you're actually making the first initial foray from IC to just an engineering manager, are there things, and I guess maybe hindsight here will help us, but are there things that coming into that first role you think are essential for that first time manager to know or to work on or try to upskill themselves?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head for one, at least from my experiences. It is a completely different role. And you cannot go into, let's say you're a very successful IC, you're staff engineer, and you're kind of switching into management. A lot of people like working with you. There's like I would say three pillars. And I've always heard this from a bunch of my managers, my bosses, that there's people, technology, and process. And when you're in IC, you're really just focused on tech. How do I code this? How do I build this thing? How do I keep, whatever technology I have running in the best way possible? You, are inundated after day one of just people problems and you're not familiar with. And it's, how do I handle this conversation? How do I hire? How do I fire? How do I, how do I delegate all these different things? You're inundated by like, what are these processes at the company? How do I fit in? How do I be successful? And I think the biggest advice that I have for a lot of engineering managers is become a student again. You almost start from ground zero. And there's this one great book that, I've recommended multiple times. It's like, what got you here will not get you there. And every single role I've had or different level of manager, let's see, or frontline manager, which I think is one of the most fun, directors, that switch from frontline manager to director is extremely different. And then going from a director to a VP, and then I would say from a VP to, an SVP, every single one is very, very different. And you don't know, there's no established patterns. 10 years ago, when I started doing, looking into this a lot more, there is no data out there. There's no, very few books. There's no, I would say, class that you can go to. So you're really learning from your own experiences, other managers, if they're great and they'll actually, teach you things, which in my case is very low. If you get above director and beyond, it's on you. You have to kind of figure it out yourself. So I read a lot. I would say nowadays there's a ton of information online, just like this podcast. But I would say lots of books available. Never stop learning. And I would say become a student again and work on the craft of engineering management. It's not the same craft as what it would be as an IC. And you really have to work at it. It's just not going to come naturally. You just, I'm a manager now. Okay, everything's going to become easy. Nope. It actually gets much, much harder. And I think there's a lot to learn. So continue learning. I would say, talk to other people who've been successful. I think that's been part. And my last thing too, I think if you are an executive leader, share the information. I've kind of had to scrounge through the internet and talk to different people. And it's been pretty difficult, I would say, over the last 15 years, trying to get all this stuff centralized. And I've actually had to do my own research process. Like, hey, I'm struggling with this project. How do we make this successful? What have you done in this? And quite honestly, there's not a lot sometimes online. Obviously, you'll have generic management books and things like that, like Andy Grove's, but not really an engineering manager. There is more now. But I think we need a lot more. So
I like it. Yeah, it's definitely true. I think that's the one thing I hear about the most when people reflect on their careers is that first step into leadership is really an interesting ramp. And we don't do a whole lot. You are right. The resources are, and also, you know what? How people learn, we're not all textbook learners. I think that's one thing I've come to realize where some of us are way, more by example, by story, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, as you mentioned, hopefully we'll get more and more of these resources. Obviously, this episode's great, and I appreciate your time and your, availability to provide and give back to the community. If somebody does have a question around something you mentioned, is there a good way of, having a follow-up with you?
Yeah, sure. LinkedIn's probably the best. It's the easiest now. I'm not on too many socials, but LinkedIn is one. So just hit me up there. Send me an invite, send me a DM on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to reach out. If you have a question, I'd love to hear it. So.
Absolutely. I definitely will make sure that people do that. And John, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Amir.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think John did a great job of telling us a little bit about his day in the life as a technology executive, what he has to go through, some of the challenges of managing his day, how he evaluates himself and tries to, manage his calendar best he can. And we also touched on what it's like to take that step up and kind of what you need to be aware of when you are taking that first step into engineering leadership roles. And obviously would appreciate if you guys would share John's insights with others that also might benefit from it. And please like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.